Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the William G. McGowan Theater. For those of you who are with us in the room and all of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel, welcome to the National Archives for our first inaugural McGowan Forum on Ethics and Leadership. For the past decade, the National Archives has hosted 2 annual McGowan Forums. It used to be Fora when I was growing up, but all of a sudden it's forums now. On women in leadership and on communications in honor of MCI Communications founder William G. McGowan. These events explored subjects from political cartoons to presidential photographers and press secretaries. In light of increasing interest in the topic, we decided to shift the focus of the McGowan Forum from communications to ethics. This change in subject ties in nicely to the legacy of Bill McGovern, after whom this theater is named, and the McGowan Fellows Program, which promotes ethical business practices in universities across the country. For our inaugural event, we are tackling ethics in journalism, and tonight a distinguished panel of active journalists and policy influencers will explore the critical ethical questions raised by our modern media structure. Before we get to today's program, I'd like to tell you about 2 upcoming programs in this theater. Tomorrow, Thursday, March 30th at 7:30 p.m., we'll commemorate Seward's Day, the 150th anniversary of U.S. Secretary of State William Henry Seward's signing of the Alaska Treaty of Secession that purchased Russian America. It's very fitting that it happened in this building because upstairs in one of our vaults we have the check for $7.2 million drawn on the Riggs Bank here in Washington, with which the United States bought Alaska. We are joining with the state of Alaska to present a performance by the Alaska Chamber Group Wild Shore New Music. Wild Shore will perform the work of living composers who have found inspiration from the natural beauty and indigenous cultures of Alaska. And on Thursday, April 13th at 7 p.m., we will join with the U.S. World War I Centennial Commission to present 100 Years, World War I and the Weight of Sacrifice. A distinguished panel will discuss the National World War I Memorial, its concept and its design. The memorial in Pershing Park in Washington is scheduled to be dedicated in November of 2018. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. As the National Archives nonprofit partner, the foundation generates financial and creative support for the National Archives exhibits, public programs, and educational activities. And there are also applications for membership outside in the lobby as well as on the archivesfoundation.org website. And a little known secret, which I keep telling everyone about, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. The theater where we are gathered this evening and the program you're about to see tonight exists because of the generosity of one of our most important partners, the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund, a philanthropic family foundation established in 1992 to perpetuate William McGowan's tradition of compassionate philanthropy and ethical leadership. The vision of the fund is to impact lives today, create sustainable change, and empower future generations to achieve their greatest potential. In addition to their support of the National Archives Foundation, the Chicago-based McGowan Charitable Fund promotes, nurtures, and funds many other signature programs throughout the United States. We thank them for their continued support of our programs over the years. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Marianne Rosica Brand, a member of the Board of Directors of the McGowan Charitable Fund.
Thank you, David. On behalf of the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund Board and staff, good evening, and welcome to the inaugural McGowan Forum on Ethics and Leadership. Over the past 2 decades, the McGowan Charitable Fund has granted over $140 million to effective community-based organizations. Our funding initiatives expand the legacy and preserve the values of Bill McGowan, a communications industry icon and my uncle. In the 1980s, Bill led his small telecommunications company, MCI, in a protracted David and Goliath court battle, challenging AT&T's longtime monopoly on U.S. phone service. MCI's ultimate victory opened the door to healthy pricing competition, improved consumer service, and far-reaching technological advances. Bill McGowan was a staunch businessman who believed in doing things one way, the right way. Through his battle against AT&T, Uncle Bill's intrinsic core values and belief that every person should have the right to fair pricing and choice were a driving force. He believed that a monopoly was unconstitutional and denigrated our democracy. Within MCI, he was a beloved leader. Many today who have gone on to run large companies still attribute their success to Bill McGowan, and many more still sing his praises. He was relentless in his quest to deregulate the telecommunications industry, but did so in a fair and honest way and for the betterment of society. Shortly after Bill died in 1993, our family, including his widow, Sue Gin McGowan, established the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund in accordance with his desire. We wanted to memorialize Bill's generosity, intrinsic optimism, and conviction that people will thrive when provided with a healthy environment, quality education, and opportunities to advance. Over the years, we have partnered with community-based providers across the U.S. that support education initiatives for underserved youth, healthcare and medical research, and addressing basic human needs. As a living legacy to Bill McGowan, we are proud to have our McGowan Fellows Program, supporting second-year MBA students who are aspiring leaders. Former National Archives board member Sue Gin McGowan was a tireless partner in the Archives' efforts to engage and reach young people and the professionals and parents who teach them, thereby continuing her husband's commitment to expanding educational opportunities for all individuals. We are pleased that the McGowan Charitable Fund has left an indelible mark on the National Archives, providing support for free educational programming to diverse audiences from across the nation and the world, and helping the archives share with more than the 1 million annual visitors from around the world the historical significance and modern relevance of our records of our democracy. That includes this state-of-the-art theater. The expansion of live streaming capabilities in recent years has increased online viewership and audience reach, placing the William G. McGowan Theater in the digital world as a resource for civic learning. We thank those of you joining us online today. Our annual McGowan Forums are part of our enduring partnership with the National Archives Foundation. In addition to McGowan Forums on women in leadership and on communications, tonight we launched the first of our series on ethics and leadership. This new forum was an obvious extension of our McGowan Fellows program, which is steeped in ethics and leadership. This program was carefully designed over 8 years ago as a living legacy to Bill McGowan. Bill had received a second-year scholarship that enabled him to complete his second year of MBA candidacy at Harvard University. The board imagined what a program might look like that honored Bill's experience. Leadership, integrity, and ethical were words that quickly rose to the top of our working sessions. And after many days of deliberation, the McGowan Fellows Program, a fellowship for second-year MBA students who have received high academic standing and are steeped in societal concern, was born. Today, our fellows, who are committed to ethical leadership, undertake social impact projects during their fellowship year to learn of today's social challenges and to build a strong community of like-minded leaders. They then continue their engagement as alumni. At the core of this program lies our belief that building awareness of ethical consideration will lead to positive social change and inspire future business and community leaders. Starting our Ethics and Leadership series with a discussion of ethics in journalism, felt like a natural alignment for the McGowan Fund and for the National Archives. A hallmark of a democratic society is a free and open press, and something that sets the United States apart from many other countries. And yet, one only needs to turn on the TV today to see that how we receive news has changed since our grandparents' generation. And with the technological changes must come evolving questions of ethics. How we receive information, how we share information, and as importantly, what responsibilities lie with the newsmakers and generators who are disseminating that information. Tonight is not a referendum on the 2016 election. It's a referendum on the state of the media on March 29th. And I, for one, am excited to see where the discussion takes us. Joining us here tonight is class of 2011 McGowan Fellow David Edelman. David has been an exemplary McGowan Fellow. He was one of the 10 inaugural fellows, so it was befitting that David eagerly agreed to serve on the National Archives Foundation Committee and the launch of this new program series. During David's fellowship year, he and his classmates launched the development of an ethics curriculum to be delivered to high school students. Several years and iterations later, this curriculum has been formalized and delivered by Aurora University in Illinois. This is but one example of the social impact projects our McGowan Fellows endeavor. We are proud that they are making a difference in society. David Edelman is the Vice President of Business Development at VIA, an innovative on-demand transit company. Prior to VIA, David worked at Snagajob, founded a venture-backed startup, and worked in management consulting and private equity. David received his MBA from the Wharton School, where he was selected as Wharton's McGowan Fellow, and did his undergraduate studies at Harvard. He serves on the board of directors for CHIP of Virginia and on the advisory board of Boston International, a nonprofit he co-founded. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Melissa, who's here in the audience, and 2-year-old son, Griffin. Please join me in welcoming David Edelman.
Thank you, Marianne. And thanks to all of you for coming here tonight, both in person and for the thousands joining us online. Welcome on behalf of the McGowan Fellows. I've been lucky to be a part of an amazing community of fellows over the past 6 years, and I'm thrilled that the foundation is now adding the Ethics and Leadership Forum. And what a way to kick things off with our distinguished panel tonight. Jay Cost is a senior writer at the Weekly Standard and author of 2 books, most recently, A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. Amy Holyfield is a Deputy Managing Director for Politics and Features at the Tampa Bay Times. She directs national political coverage, including the Newspapers Bureau in Washington, PolitiFact.com, PunditFact.com, and PolitiFact Florida, the Times fact-checking website. Nick Lehman is the Pulitzer Moore Professor of Journalism at Columbia University. From 2003 until 2013, he was Dean of Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. During his career, he was as a journalist, he has worked at the Washington Monthly, Texas Monthly, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, and the New Yorker. Craig Newmark is a web pioneer, philanthropist, speaker, and one of America's most recognized nerds. He is actually a really big nerd, he tells me. In 1995, he founded Craigslist, which to date has seen more than 5 billion classified ads posted. In 2012, he was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame. In 2016, he created the Craig Newmark Foundation, a private foundation to promote philanthropy and civic engagement through a number of initiatives. And finally, our moderator tonight is Margaret Sullivan, media columnist for the Washington Post. Before joining the Post, she was the New York Times public editor and previously the chief editor of the Buffalo News, her hometown paper where she started as a summer intern. She was a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board from 2011 to 2012 and twice elected as the director of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, where she led the First Amendment Committee. While living in Manhattan, Sullivan taught at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University and City University of New York. Please join me in welcoming our panelists this evening.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see everyone and in this beautiful auditorium. I'm sure we're going to have a stimulating and I hope enjoyable discussion tonight. We certainly have a tremendous panel, and just to tell you who's who, I know you heard a little bit of description, but Craig Newmark off on the end, Nick Lemon. So Craig Newmark of Craigslist and the Craig Newmark Foundation. Nick Lemon of Columbia University and the New Yorker, among many other places. Amy Hollyfield of the Tampa Bay Times, and Jay Cost of the Weekly Standard. And I'm Margaret Sullivan. So we'll jump right into it. I'm hoping that we'll have a wide-ranging discussion in which we'll talk about media bias, trust in the press or lack of trust, the blending of news and opinion, the problem of so-called fake news, and we will have to touch on whether the press is indeed the opposition party. So I think I'd like to start with Nick. Nick, we hear often these days that we live in a post-fact or a post-truth world. To what extent is this a new problem or issue? Can you place us in historical context?
Well, I'll try. You know, some of you have heard this phrase, "Make America Great Again," and
Heard it.
that's really a reference to a period in American history that, in a whole bunch of ways, it was atypical, roughly 1950 to 1980. And a lot of journalists who might not sign on to Make America Great Again would like to make journalism great again. That is, recreating some of the conditions during that period that no longer exist. So I think as a frame in all realms, thinking of that sort of those post-war decades as the baseline is misleading. I often ask my students and get a totally blank look, but maybe in this room I won't. Have you ever seen the front page? Anybody?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a few people anyway. If not, rush out and rent it or watch it on Roku. There's about 10 versions over the years. It's about the newspaper industry in the 1920s. It's a good, among many, it's a good baseline setter because you don't see a lot of public policy concern there. You don't see a lot of public service watchdog reporting. You don't see a lot of concern for facts. The super simple way to put it is that first there was an era of partisanship in journalism in the 19th century when journalism existed as and was funded by the political parties, and many towns and cities in the United States would have two papers, one called the Democrat and one called the Republican. And the purpose of journalism was to sort of support the parties. So that's one phase. Then you get the sort of yellow journalism or penny press phase that came with the rise of big cities. This was a circulation-based model, another cultural reference. Anybody seen Newsies? So this is the heyday of Newsies when instead of being supported by political parties, newspapers were supported by the public, but the way they got that support was by emphasizing the sensational and super interesting, sometimes with the truth being a casualty. So that was a phase. And then in the early 20th century, you started to see the beginnings of objective journalism economically supported by these more stable sources like advertising and subscription rather than single copy sales on the streets. Even then, most cities had 10, 12 daily newspapers trying to kill each other. Okay, so then we go to this Make Journalism Great Again baseline period. Out of all the newspaper wars, there emerged a situation where most big cities had one monopoly paper that was so profitable that it could afford to do all this sort of public-spirited stuff, much like many other corporations used to take on those duties. And then you had a very different electronic media environment. You had basically radio and television. They were heavily regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. The basic bargain was there'll only be a limited number of outlets. If the FCC lets you operate one, same thing, you have a license to print money. There's no way you can lose. And in return for this gift from the government, there's all this stuff you have to do. You have to have educational programming. And the government quasi-forced the broadcast networks to get into the news business, or certainly pressured them to do that. So during that period, when I was young, and which as a young person I thought would last forever, things were a little different. And everything I just told you about that period blew up for various reasons, good and bad. And that's the world we live in now. I'll stop there because others may, or maybe I will later, tell you how it all blew up. But that's what you have to understand. Wasn't, you know, the Make Journalism Great Again period was a moment, and the moment wasn't the whole history, and it's over now.
Do you give it an end point?
No, because one of the great things about studying history is it changes all the time, and it's you know, one of the things that I think is annoying about journalism is this idea that the founders wrote the First Amendment imagining the press as it is now. One of my colleagues on the faculty at Columbia Journalism, so we have a very beautiful statue in front of our school of Thomas Jefferson. The reason it's there is there's, you know, in Jefferson's voluminous writings, he once said something like, I would rather, what's the quote, Jade? I would rather have press without government than government without the press. What does that mean? He really hated government. It doesn't mean that he liked the press. There's all these other, you know, Jefferson quotes about how much he hated the press, as most of the founders did. And one of our professors has this sort of joking campaign to take down the Jefferson statue because it's so ahistorical. So please don't imagine what one hears about, that the journalism banquets that some of us have gone to, that, you know, they sat down, they fought the American Revolution in order to have the media establishment, then they instantiated it in the Constitution. They decided to put it in the First Amendment instead of the Second Amendment because it was so important. And that's kind of how it was up until very recently. Not true.
All right. Next, I'd like to turn to Jay Cost. Jay, give us a sense of what it's like at this moment to be a part of the conservative news media. To what extent are the problems of the press also the problems of the conservative press? And specifically, what is your view of the idea, you may agree with it or not, that the mainstream press is plagued with liberal bias?
Well, this is a difficult time for the conservative press, at least from my perspective. I mean, my magazine was very vehemently opposed to the nomination of Donald Trump. And, you know, Bill Kristol, who at the time was our editor-in-chief, was one of the many people who wrote in the National Review Symposium against Trump in, I think it was January of last year. And, you know, the anti-Trump forces sort of splintered off into various subsets. The Weekly Standard ended up being Never Trump, and I think probably a handful of people at the magazine voted for Trump, but I reckon the overwhelming majority, myself included, did not. And it remains a difficult time because, you know, I think because we're betwixt and between in a lot of respects. I mean, you know, American politics is understood and conceptualized through a two-party framework. So, you know, when Trump won, it was an obvious place for Democrats to move into the opposition. But those of us who didn't like Trump, didn't think he was temperamentally suited to the office, who didn't like his Gilded Age ideas on trade, his deficit finance infrastructure proposal, all these things. We're not Democrats, we're not liberals, we're still conservatives. And so we find ourselves in a very peculiar spot because it's sort of like, well, we like Neil Gorsuch, but, we don't like, we don't like Mike Flynn, running around the National Security Agency. So, and I don't know how that is going to play itself out. I mean, I know on a personal level, I lost some professional relationships fell apart because of the Trump phenomenon and how it split conservatives into different groups and for various reasons.
We all had a very difficult Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, to your second question about media bias, I mean, I think that as a conservative, I feel like the media is biased. I mean, it's impressionistic. I mean, you can't quantify it. Despite what the Media Research Center thinks it's doing, it can't be quantified. But I do think that, but the bias that I detect is not, conspiratorial or malicious. It's not intentional. I think that it's a selection bias, which is to say that people who are conservative are less likely than liberals to go into journalism. And then I think that that's probably reinforced by confirmation bias. When you're around people who are have a similar view as you do, you're just inclined to sort of see things a certain way. I don't think, by the way, that that's to Nick's point about the history of American journalism. I mean, look, the press, insofar as it existed in 1787, was biased in favor of the ratification of the Constitution. I mean, human beings are biased, and biases often exist according to, socioeconomic status and type of employment and, all those things. And so I think that those factors tend to accumulate to, a liberal bias, but that is not as pernicious as a lot of conservatives think, because after all, Republicans have been doing very well in the last 30 years. They've been winning a lot of elections simultaneously with complaining about the media. So I don't think it makes that huge of a deal, and I also don't think it's intentional. It's conspiratorial, like all of you are whispering when I went into the bathroom, like, oh, we're gonna, it's nothing. I don't think it's anything like that.
You mentioned when we were just chatting earlier that you have observed journalists on social media and have been appalled at times. You didn't say appalled, but
Yeah.
that their clear biases are showing more on Twitter, for example, than would creep into a news story or even an analysis piece. Tell us about your observations.
Well, Twitter is a very is a very peculiar form of media because it's a very impulsive. People, because there's so few characters and all you do is click tweet and it goes out into the world. It tends to. I know, for instance, when I write pieces for the magazine, I'll read them and reread them, and my first drafts tend to be, have a certain sarcastic kind of way to them, but as I edit them, I edit out the sarcasm, but it doesn't get edited out of Twitter. So Twitter is this sort of interesting, almost kind of like, an id almost. And I have noticed that journalists, it's nothing, pernicious about it, but I have noticed that there's a real sort of snarky kind of perspective, which is common in Twitter. But the snark tends to be kind of a left-leaning snark, if that makes sense. And it tends to be the younger journalists, particularly like the campaign embeds. I think the ones who were, probably jumped onto Twitter as soon as it started and took to it right away. I don't think that the older journalists that I follow on Twitter are as inclined to that. But I have noticed that it's a very distinct impression that I have gotten about Twitter among journalists. And I'd add, too, that I think they use Twitter too much. I mean, I don't understand. I mean, I appreciate the bigger perspective from the media and stuff, but I think, my editor at the Weekly Standard, Steve Hayes, might call me up and say, Jay, you got to quit writing for free for them and write for us. And I think that there's, I think that
A
all
lot
of us.
of people use Twitter too much, though.
Yeah, I think
But
I.
a lot of us get the opposite
Yeah.
instruction from editors. Tweet, why aren't you
Tweet
tweeting more?
more,
You know
right.
that, right?
There you go. Okay. I want to turn to, I should have mentioned right away that we will be taking questions from the audience and would love to have them. So as you're thinking of ideas that come up for you and questions you may have, jot them down or keep them in mind, and we will turn to audience questions before too very long. Now I'd like to move to Craig Newmark. Craig, as the founder of Craigslist, you have now taken on a great interest in journalism issues, including with generous funding, for which many of us are appreciative. Tell us about how this evolved. How did you go from being a businessman and a techie, or a nerd, as you like to call yourself, to someone who's very much involved in the journalism world these days?
I am strictly a news consumer. I just want news I can trust. And this has to do with Mr. Shulsky in high school history in roughly 1970. What he taught us was pretty much that a trustworthy press is like the immune system of democracy. Or as more recently put, democracy dies in darkness.
Where did I see that?
Yeah. And so my interests are that, well, for over 10 years, I've been getting a bit of an education in journalism. I don't really know the field, because you really don't know the field unless you have to write to deadline daily, more or less, over a period of years, and I've never done that. All I know is that brevity is the soul of wit, which gives me an excuse to write very briefly. But I figure I've seen a lot of things go wrong in journalism, but I do remember from Sunday school that it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. So instead of complaining about fake news for one reason or another, I would try to help people who I saw were doing a good job do an even better job without going on at very tedious length. Like there's the folks at the Trust Project doing basic work on ethics, trying to figure out what does it mean when we're talking about trustworthy journalism. To enforce that, I'm supporting the International Fact-Checking Network out of Poynter Institute, and also working with groups like the First Draft Coalition. The deal with these is that no one's going to be an arbiter of truth. It's just that a news organization can say, hey, we're going to adhere to these ethical rules, rules of trustworthy behavior, and then the fact checkers can do something to keep them honest. Then I can talk to my technology fellows, because, you know, we're pretty slow to really understand a problem that's not a technology problem. And the problems of journalism are human problems, not technology problems. It takes us a while to get it. It takes us a while to react. And frankly, and speaking with bitter experience, it takes us a long time to understand the need to do good communications and even PR about it. I can say unequivocally that the technology platforms have gotten the message, and as a class, I guess, we understand what we don't know, and we're now taking actions to address it, but it's a big human problem, and it'll take a while. There's other issues too. I'm very concerned that bad actors attack journalists, primarily through harassment and bullying, that kind of thing. So I'm starting to chat very quietly with news organizations about them protecting themselves and each other. And that's a big deal too.
Do you mean, when you say that, do you mean protecting them legally, or what do you have in mind?
We need to find ways to protect journalists from harassment, bullying, from frivolous lawsuits, and sometimes from violence, because this has graduated to violence in a few cases. And there are some people, some journalists, who are good at defending themselves, often because they know the forensics required to do the right investigation. That's what happens, let's say, when the journalist involved is a technology journalist. But for the most part, if you're the subject of a lot of death threats and so on, that can kind of make it a really bad day for you. But the idea, though, is to do constructive, smart things to help make journalism great again, which is to help restore journalism to being the immune system of democracy.
Very good. Thank you, Craig. Amy, Amy's paper, the Tampa Bay Times, is the home of PolitiFact. PolitiFact, which hands out ratings such as pants on fire to some of the worst political lies out there, won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 2009. Now, fact-checking, which I think we can say, if it didn't start with PolitiFact, that was certainly a major development. Now fact-checking seems to have grown into a whole global industry. Do we need this many fact-checkers? And more importantly, how much difference do they really make?
I think we do. Absolutely. It's been, I'll just say, to give credit, factcheck.org really started this out of the University of Pennsylvania. PolitiFact got involved back in 2007, and certainly I think we've contributed to the worldwide movement that's happened. And I think it's been glorious. I think it's welcome. We're actually having International Fact-Checking Day this Sunday after April Fool's Day,
Right.
To bring some attention to our work and to fact-checking and how important it is to democracy. I don't see it as a bad thing that there's more of them. I do see it as a bad thing that the impact isn't as predominant as it could be. We keep track of things like whether people correct themselves or whether people acknowledge mistakes. And you kind of wish it were a little more frequent than it is. I'd say some people are pretty upfront about it. Some people change their talking points based on ratings that PolitiFact gives them. But most people are just like, there's not just care for it. We've done studies on our work and looking at the impact, and we feel it from the readers, the consumers of news, and that's who we're writing for. We got into this as a public service to voters and wanting to help sort fact from fiction for people trying to engage in democracy. So on that sense, we feel like we're winning. But we've also done studies to show how fact-checking has affected politicians in their environment as it's sort of changing their behavior, and it does affect them. There's studies that show that. But like I say, you kind of want to see people acknowledging their mistakes or caring that they're happening, and I think you can see even in recent history that that's not true.
I want to stay with you, but change subjects a little bit. When I was a regional journalist in Buffalo, which I was for many years, I looked at the Tampa Bay Times, then the St. Petersburg Times, as absolutely one of the best regional papers in the country. I think there's no doubt of that. It's a wonderful newspaper and now digital media organization. But I'm worried about the future of local journalism, and certainly the economics of it are troubling. My longtime boss was Warren Buffett. He owned the paper in Buffalo, and he's not particularly bullish on the future of newspaper companies. Talk to us a little bit about what the problems are and what the issues are and what we stand to lose there.
I think that's a significant concern. The problems are the industry's just changed dramatically, and what was a very robust business has changed because of the way consumers come to news and where people get their news. And newspapers have definitely taken a hit in that. But to talk about local journalism, I mean, there's fewer newspapers than there have been at any time. And you see some really strong examples of local journalism, and certainly in the recent conversations of the election, of this recent debate that we've had over healthcare. I mean, you've seen some really strong examples of newspapers that have stepped up and been involved in that. But resource is an absolute issue, and that's something my paper deals with, and that's something that I probably most newspapers deal with. What's interesting, and something happened this week, the Democracy Fund, which is actually a funder of PolitiFact, just this week made huge grants to help local news reporting. They gave some money to ProPublica and some other places, but their goal was to make sure there's reporters in every corner, because without that, we're really at risk of not knowing everything that's going on. And I'm very proud of the Tampa Bay Times and what we've been able to do and how we've been able to keep up with a very, very robust investigative team, with having PolitiFact at all. Very rare for a regional newspaper to start a national website that's gained some ground. But that's a rarity, and it's definitely a concern.
Mm-hmm. Jay, you live in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And you write for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette sometimes.
I do.
Talk to us about your experience with local journalism and what you think the future looks like.
Yeah, it's disconcerting. Pittsburgh had two newspapers. We had the Post-Gazette and we had the Tribune-Review. And after Richard Mellon Scaife passed away, I think it was last year, might have been the year before, but that was sort of the death knell of the Trib. And so now there's, now there's just one paper. And the resource problems are obvious. You don't have to be in the newsroom. You look at the size of the local news section. I mean, it's one thing to look at the national section where they pick up stories from the AP and the Washington Post and the New York Times, but you look at their own original reporting on local and state issues, it's very, very meager. And, I find that as somebody who, I consider myself a constitutionalist, and a Republican in the classic sense of the word, that we have federal level of government, but our system was designed to separate power between the national government and the state governments and local communities, and each of them are really delegated certain tasks, and to see the attention of the public, and I think this is one reason why local papers are struggling, is that people don't seem as interested in local issues anymore, and that they're not willing to pay for it, and they're distracted, I think, by a lot of foolish symbolic cultural issues that don't actually affect their lives, and so and it whether or not they end up overlooking what's happening in their own communities, and so from my perspective, if you don't have an informed public, then how are you going to keep your governors accountable? Because in a Republican form of government, the first three words of our Constitution are "We the people." It's in the preamble, "We the people." It starts with the people. All power flows from the people, but that requires a certain level of knowledge and involvement from the public, and I'm worried that the offerings. I'm worried not only that there's not very much offered. I'm also worried that the paper is responding to the economic forces, that people and communities are increasingly they just turn on Fox News and get whatever the outrage du jour is, rather than actually opening up their newspaper and reading about what the Pittsburgh City Council is actually doing.
Nick, I'd like to turn to the question of the blending of news and opinion. That certainly seems to be more prevalent. There's a immediate news peg for this in the dust-up we saw between Sean Hannity and Ted Koppel, in which Hannity proposed the idea that people understood very well that commentary was commentary and news is news, and Koppel told him he was part of the problem, or actually was the problem, was hurting America. what do you think about the way people encounter news? Do you see a problem with, is the reason we think that the news media, so many people think the news media is biased, is because they're reading opinion pieces, but perhaps in thinking that they're news stories?
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Let me say a few things about this. I want to go back a little bit to your previous question, some of what Jay was saying, just for people who aren't journalists. Because, you can think about existing institutional structures, and then you can think about principles. When we're talking about newspapers, we're talking about institutional structures. When we're talking about news and opinion, we're talking about sort of functional ideas. So if you took a typical American regional metropolitan area in 1995, let's say there were 1,500 journalists employed full-time in that city, reporters and editors and so on. In the typical city, of that 1,500, maybe 1,300 would be sitting in one room, which is the newspaper newsroom. And the other 200 would be scattered between all the TV stations, all the radio stations, the alt weekly, the city magazine, whatever else existed in the media landscape. So there was a tradition that the newspaper carried this load of doing the original reporting, the data collection in the area, and doing the tremendous lion's share of that. And it could do it because it could afford to do it for a while. And the newspaper was this sort of keeper of this norm separating news and opinion. And in broadcast, FCC regulation was pushing in that direction. We deregulated broadcast in the 1980s under Mark Fowler as head of the FCC. And then, the newspaper industry has undergone a tremendous economic decline. So if you move the function of journalism outside the institution of newspapers, which is what we're seeing happen, and a lot of it, frankly, is just moving from an employee structure to a freelancer and volunteer structure. It's not necessarily the case, as we're discovering, that all the norms that sat inside the institution travel when you take the institution down. So, going back a little bit to what I said at the outset, the separation of news and opinion wasn't there from the beginning of journalism anywhere. It was a 20th century pretty much creation, and pretty much created by the newspaper industry and enforced by the newspaper industry in its heyday, with the regulated and limited broadcast industry playing a strong second place. And then you have a totally different environment, and it's very hard to enforce. A couple of things just quickly as sort of thought experiments as we continue the discussion. I went to a lot of conferences on the media back when I was a journalism school dean. So if you went back to, say, 2000 and you said, I have a fabulous idea about how to structure journalism in the media, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of all the gatekeepers who keep you from knowing things. We're going to get rid of the we talk, you listen construct. And instead we're going to have a totally free system where literally anybody in the world can put out whatever they call journalism to whoever wants to read it, and anybody in the world can receive whatever they want journalistically. I think most people, not only then but now, would say, wow, I love that. What a fabulous system. That sounds ideal. It sounds much better than what we had then. Well, it turns out, and I'm not saying it isn't a fabulous system, but when you create it, it then becomes much, much harder to enforce these systemic norms. It's kind of obvious conceptually, but it's striking when it hits you in the face. So, as a way to think about it, the easy part of the problem, although it's not easy, is creating real news. We all kind of know how to do that. At least those of us on the panel, we know what it looks like. We know what it takes to produce. the fact-checking sector as a sort of add-on to the real news sector is really important. That's doable. That, it's a struggle, especially economically, but, that's a goal that we can really achieve. The hard part is the two related questions of, is it okay to create a healthy, vibrant, we hope, real news sector and fact-checking sector, knowing that alongside it will be a very, very large BS sector? And do we care that lots and lots of people out there presented with the choice, even if clearly told which is which, are going to choose the latter over the former? If we don't care about those things, then I think, sleep well tonight. We're going to make it. If we do care about those things, the other panelists will tell how to fix them because I don't really know.
Okay. We all know that the press is one of the many American institutions which is registering very low numbers on the trust meter. And while institutional trust has declined across the board, I think we still need to take it seriously. Craig, I want to ask you, because you have such an interest in the subject of fake news and what to do about it, how you think, as a news consumer and now I think a student of the sort of media ecosystem, how would you go about restoring trust, if it's possible?
Since I'm Mr. Positive, before I focused on the elements of trustworthy journalism, that is, commit to a code of ethics and stick with it, and then to help, get some help protecting your people. But the fake news industry, whether it's sites which are there only to produce fake news, deceptive news, or if it has to do with news organizations which produce a lot of deceptive news, but also some real stuff, the people who might have the best idea, like the folks at Sleeping Giants, what they're saying is that, hey, ad networks and advertisers, if you know a site is producing deceptive material, fake news, don't put your ads there. Because fake news sites, whether in whole or in part, rely in large part on advertising revenue to exist. This kind of thing is starting. There's nothing to announce about it, in part because these people, especially as they do social network analysis of what the problem is in a deep way, actually have found themselves in some physical danger. But the idea is that this is a thing. It is starting, and it ties into the networks of fact checkers and so on. And the idea is that if you're an advertiser, you don't want your ads to be associated with deceptive or completely dishonest news. You may not want it to be associated with news of a racist or misogynist nature, and that was a news item days ago regarding Facebook and Google. So this is beginning to be a thing. These are difficult problems, and again, while they're partly technology problems, they're still mostly human problems, because we have seen that when fake news sites are sometimes deprived of that revenue, they complain, and they're pretty well funded and have few scruples. There is hope, but it means the whole industry has to act together to provide the least good targets for bad actors.
We're not a particularly good industry about working together. It's not in our DNA, I don't think.
The news industry is better about working together than any other area, of, at least nonprofit-wise. Just like I work in the veterans and military family space, even today, and they don't work well together. But news organizations, as shown in like the Electionland thing on November 8th, people actually work together to figure out what problems could be seen with voting irregularities.
Amy, if you were put in charge of fixing the trust problem with the news media, what would be some of the things you would do? Or what kinds of things have you seen work at your paper and more broadly?
Craig, I will say, just hit on two really important things. One, the advertising and how important that is to these proliferators of fake news, and cutting that system is something. But the other thing being the code of principles that journalists, we come with, that our education, our experience, the ethics that we apply to, but I don't think we're really good about explaining to people what those are and what the principles are that we're following. That's something we've done with fact checking, the International Fact Checking Network. We started a code of principles last year, and we've been the network has been sort of putting a stamp of approval on fact checkers as they're sort of checked out. Are you doing this? Are you transparent? How are you dealing with telling people about your funding? How are you? There's a whole list of things, and they're sort of being vetted and getting approval. That's something. I'll tell you another thing we have a lot of conversations about is just getting to the people. Sometimes there's separation between media and consumers, and the idea of making that a more personal conversation than a distant conversation, I think, is important. Like I said, with PolitiFact, we've just in the last couple of days been talking about how do we get to the audience that we're not reaching. How do we get to that set of consumers, of voters that think we're not for them and think we're not part of that conversation? Because we know we are, since we are nonpartisan and have no hesitation about going after anyone who's not telling the truth or representing the right the facts about policy. But I'm not sure people know that. So
how do you get that message across?
We speak about it a lot.
You're figuring it out.
And we try. We have a list of principles that are on our website. We are transparent about our funding. We try to be. Transparency is sort of one of the hallmarks of PolitiFact, and how we do our reporting. And so we try to be as transparent as we can about the organization. But we've been talking a lot about, should we go on should we do like PolitiFact pop-up events? Should we go show up in different cities or college campuses? Or is there some sort of outreach program we need to do to bring our work to the eyes that aren't seeing them?
We are going to go to questions fairly soon, but I do want to talk to Jay about something pretty interesting that's happening in the media world these days, which is the addition of, I guess I'll say, non-traditional media members in places like the White House briefing room, or in covering, for example, a pool reporter that is the proxy for the rest of the press. Recently covering the vice president was from the Daily Signal. The Daily Signal is funded by the Heritage Foundation. There's more apparently partisan media. I'm not singling out the Daily Signal, which I actually think is pretty legit, but certainly we're seeing many new faces, many new kinds of media members in these traditional settings. And I wonder what you think about that, and what restrictions and what freedoms should be brought to bear.
Yeah, it's something that I have mixed feelings about. I think Nick had hit upon this earlier with his sort of thought experiment about imagining everything being free and open in 2000, which is actually how I got my job, because it was through a blog in 2004 that people read, and I was able to do this for a living. And absent that opportunity, I wouldn't be here. But at the same time, when you lower the barriers to entry, you're going to get a lot of people that really want in. So the disadvantage about, the internet, is that by the enormous advantages to lowering the barriers to entry, and on net, it's a social good, but, it's not, there are costs. And I think that the problem has been particularly acute on the conservative side of the spectrum over the last couple years. I'm not exactly sure why, but I think that, there are some really, when we're talking about fake news, we're talking about certain conservative outlets. I mean, really, that's what we're talking about. And as a conservative who, I agree, and I know that,
It's not a problem only on the right, certainly.
no, but I think it's gotten acute on the right, and I think it's important to differentiate, like, for instance, between, National Review, which is an opinion magazine, but at the same time, Robert Costa was a reporter for National Review. He's now at the Washington Post. Tim Alberto was a reporter for the National Review. He's now at Politico. Our reporters at the Weekly Standard, John McCormick and Mike Warren, when they actually, report something that if McCormick tells me that this happened, I believe that it happened. But, there's some really irresponsible outlets on the right now, I think, and not just limited to the internet. And so that creates a problem, like, well, what do you do? And it's hard, I think, to lay down any kind of definitive barrier, but I would say that, for instance, you mentioned the Daily Signal, which is connected to Heritage. Heritage is an ideological organization, but if you read Heritage, you'll see that they're really serious about what they do. They're really, Bob Moffett does healthcare policy, and you may disagree with Bob Moffett, but he cares very deeply about this, and he's studied it very closely. And I think that the Daily Signal in general reflects those values, and so it can sort of be seen from the same lens that you look at National Review and you look at the Weekly Standard. But then, the Gateway pundit getting a seat in the White House briefing room is, to me, very troubling, because that's an example of an organization that I don't think is responsible. And I think that that's, left or right, I think that that's where the line needs to be drawn, is that are these people, separating fact from opinion is hard because, facts in society, facts and values are sort of all intertwined with one another. And I think in a lot of respects, the best, maybe the best strategy for all intents and purposes is just to have, a responsible, diligent, conservative media news opinion outlets and liberal media news opinion outlets. And, there's sort of an implicit, I'd like to think that there's an implicit alliance there, regardless of what your ideological view is, based on your commitment to good faith and to be responsible. And that, like, the Daily Signal people, think that they're, are honestly trying to get to the truth. But, you go to Gateway Pundit, it's a completely different story. And that is something that worries me as a conservative, because I see voices like that increasingly coming to dominate our side's discourse. And I was very disappointed. And I was at first very optimistic. When I found out National Review was running that symposium against Trump, I thought, well, this is good. This is good timing. Let's get this out there. But there, certain actors just pounded us down, and it really made me very aware that we're not the force that we thought we were on our own side. And I think as a conservative, that troubles me, and also as somebody who consumes responsible news, that troubles me. And I think that where that line is, I don't think it's necessarily like, oh, you need to be a straight news outlet, but I think it has to be like you have to demonstrate a commitment to trying to get it right. And I think that for practically speaking, moving forward, I think that's where it should be.
That seems to be a fairly low bar. But an important one. We have a microphone there and one here, and certainly would love to take some questions, and I see there are people. So I hope that, and I believe I have questions from our streamed audience as well. Would you please identify yourself in some way as you ask your question? If you have an affiliation you think we should know about, let us know, but go right ahead.
I'm a part-time resident in DC, a permanent resident for now. In Hollywood, Florida, I have my own consulting company working with not-for-profits. I've been a founding member of 100 Reporters, have worked with, well, I was the president of Broward's ACLU and a whole bunch of other stuff for the public good. That aside, if I can refer to you by your first names, I hope you don't mind. As a panel and individually, Jay, you spoke about pursuit of the truth. Craig, you talked about working together as an industry. My questions, there's two, but they're interrelated. And it came up earlier today at another panel we were at earlier. Can you address what are facts versus the truth? Because that is a huge issue these days, right? Very underlying, I think. Also, as the news media, what do you think your role is, and how do you do it with respect to what is priority in presenting the news versus versus following, say, diversions, things that pop up, versus the real news, or, well, you tell me what is real news, and you tell me what is fact, and you tell me what is truth. Thank you.
Jay,
Yeah,
are you
that's
going to take that on?
Sure.
Thank you.
No, that's a great question. So I'll give you an example. So the column that I just sent off to the Weekly Standard, it'll be out online on Friday morning, was about the American Health Care Act, the Paul Ryan thing that went down in flames. And so, you know, there was this talking point that was circulating, and the president sort of facilitated it, was like, oh, you know, the Freedom Caucus, so we gave them so many things, and they just insisted on, you know, everything we gave them, they just wanted more, they're to blame. You know, the Wall Street Journal editorial board made the same comment that they got all these things, and those are true facts, right? I mean, those are the facts. Nothing that things were offered to the House Freedom Caucus, and they said yes, and then they responded by asking for more, right? So those are facts. But the truth is that this bill is not a typical bill of setting tax and appropriations levels. That this was a bill to reshape 1/6 of the American economy, and that it's properly understood more like a Jenga stack, right? And that you can't just go plucking things out and expect the whole thing to just remain in one piece. And that was the objection that the House Freedom Caucus had, was that the changes that the bill was making to American health care were, you know, while we like all of these individual changes, they are going to sum up to a disaster. And you have to give us these things to keep it from being a disaster. That's the truth, right? So what I did in sort of response to these facts is, you know, contextualize it within the broader narrative of you know, what this bill actually was, and sit down for a day and a half and turn the TV off and turn the Twitter off and think it through. And I think that's, you know, now whether or not I'm right or not, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think that's the difference between facts, because facts can be used in support of something that's not actually true, because you can take individual things and rebuild it into something that's false. And I think that the way around that is to be thoughtful and take your time and think things through. And also, when we're talking about politics and policy, you know, it requires a certain level of expertise in these matters. Now, I don't think that requires one to go and become an health economist, but, you know, if you're going to write about the American Health Care Act, then you need to know a thing or two about how American health care works.
Very good. Yes,
Specifically
Greg.
to the point of truth and facts, I'm fairly simple-minded and believe often in the honor system, and also see that reporting is really hard. So I'm happy to act if I see a reporter and editor work on good faith. For example, when they make an assertion They've done some research, they've done some fact-checking, they're just not making the thing up. And if they do get it wrong, and they will get it wrong once in a while, that they correct it in some appropriate manner. You know, truth and facts, what is truth? Those are matters of deep philosophy, which used to be fun when I was young. I think so, I kind of remember. But now I'm happy if people act in good faith and just follow through if they do get it wrong. As for the other question, again, I am concerned about what happens when crap pops up, and I do see efforts where people using deep social network analysis can trace pathways by which not only disinformation flows, but also the harassment and trolling flows. I see people doing that, so I have hope for good forensic analysis of that. I was given a bonus of hope for that in the last couple weeks, because while the TV show Homeland has a lot of flaws, if you're keeping up with the fake news operation that they're running on a massive scale, except for one special effect, that's actually pretty accurate. The big screen where they show all the influence operations in place. There's no point in having that big screen except to make it more photogenic for Dara Dahl, I think.
Let's go over
Sorry.
here. Oh, yes.
I just have to jump
Yes,
on,
of course.
on this.
It's a big subject, truth and facts and how they fit together, certainly.
I feel like what's happening right now in our society is that we can't agree on this question, and we have lost the definition of facts, and we've interpreted it different ways, and that's a real problem right now. That we've gotten away from a standard of what is an objective fact that we can all agree on. This issue of fake news that's absorbed at the highest levels of our country is an issue, and the question of batting at, you know, what do you go after, that for my organization is a big thing, because you're balancing relevance versus sort of bringing attention to the thing that you're setting the agenda for what we read. Exactly, but so that then it becomes an ethical question of, you know, our standard is to correct the record, right? So we're having to balance every day in the universe of things that we could fact check, right, which is massive. Do we go after this thing over here, or do that's blowing up on the internet? Do we get out there and correct the record, or do we let it go? We've decided to go after it. We've dedicated reporters to fact-checking fake news. For International Fact-Checking Day, we've taken our whole state network and gone after. We're doing a sprint where everybody's going after fake news. But it's a genuine question, and it's a genuine problem.
Thank you.
I'm getting a little confused on one thing with the term fake news. I had originally understood it to be something different than false information, a lie, distortions, and so on and so forth, but more like the tabloids that have woman gives birth to a Martian kind of thing, or there is a sex ring in a pizza parlor in D.C., that kind of thing.
So you're talking about the term fake news?
Yes.
Yes. Well, Nick, why don't you take this on?
So there's this term which people had barely heard a year ago, has taken off, and as it's taken off, it's become so fuzzy that it's kind of lost a lot of its meaning. What I understand fake news to be, in the sort of technical or strict sense, is what Craig was talking about, which is people sitting in little rooms, often halfway around the world, saying, we're going to just make a bunch of stuff up and then use our programming skills to make it go out as widely as possible on the internet with the intention of misleading, right? And then there's, you know, technology for doing it, and there's technology for detecting it. Then, you know, thanks in no small part to our president, who uses the phrase a lot, it became a sort of catchphrase for anything you don't agree with that the press does, you can label as fake news. And then there's the age-old definition of, the national star, baby born with 3 heads stuff, which, has been around my whole life. We didn't used to call it fake news. So I think it's more useful for this subject for discussion to stick with the sort of more technical, techie definition. But it's very hard to keep that in the box, as we've seen.
Is there a distinction, though, where it's not put out for distortion, maybe, but to get advertising, to get people to read it, going to certain groups for that purpose?
I think part of it's for the fun of it. What can I get people to latch onto? What can I get people to believe? We've interviewed some of these people who are out there. There's a guy from Clearwater who lives in Costa Rica who late last year was like, you know what, I'm going to start a website and I'm just going to make stuff up and see what happens. And it took off. And shockingly, after a little while, he felt bad about it, and he stopped. He made some money, but he stopped. But I totally agree with how Nick just defined that. We're talking about the utterly made up stuff, not the way it's been it has morphed into an insult for anything that you don't like or agree with, and that's not what we're talking about. And I think it's also important to know that this isn't a new phenomenon. People have been making up stuff forever, and certainly in politics. You think about chain emails. When PolitiFact first got started, that was the big thing. Obama was running for president, and there were just all kinds of made up things. I mean, that's just part of the fun of our society.
Let me go back just quickly to your question, which has something I think maybe embedded in it that I think I want to challenge on truth, facts, et cetera. Facts are pretty easy, If I say you're 7 years old, that's, unless I'm misreading, factually incorrect. And you can say I'm actually 23 years old. Truth is harder. There's a wonderful historian of science named Lorraine Daston in Berlin who has a distinction between what she calls mechanical objectivity, which is the exact report of how much something weighs and how tall it is and so on, and what she calls trained judgment. A lot of what we're talking about here is trained judgment. Journalism, in my opinion, and probably most people in the room, is a profession. But unlike most professions, it's unlicensed and unregulated. Perhaps that's as it should be. And so you have to recognize as context, as I get older, I find that one of the few good things about getting older is I spend a whole lot of my time, both at a university and in a journalistic context, sitting in judgment, deciding who gets into Columbia, deciding who gets a prize, deciding who gets a grant, blah, blah, blah. I spend huge amounts of time on that, which is one of the pleasures of getting older, I suppose. So there's no, real and fake or obviously right and wrong way to make those decisions. They're all arguable, I can tell you. When they're announced, they seem engraved in granite. They weren't engraved in granite when they were being decided. So on some level, the way they work is you say professionals exercising their trained judgments make judgment calls that are just simply can never get to the level of being inarguable and consensual. And that's sort of what they get to do and have to do as professionals. That doesn't sound great, but it's just, that's the way the world functions. And, if you went to the news conference at a big newspaper, it's very jarring because, the editor sits here, all the AMEs sit around, the editor says, what do you got? The editors say, no. We think that these 50 stories should be on the front page. And they're all deserving. And the editor says, well, it's my job to pick 6 out of the 50, so I picked these 6, bye, meeting's over. And you say to the editor, well, how did you pick that? Did the publisher tell you what? And he'll typically say, or she'll typically say, trained judgment. That's my best professional judgment. Might be right, might be wrong, but we don't have room for 50 stories, so somebody's got to make those kinds of decisions. And it's just, it's hard to do that in a way. There's no way to do, I mean, we've all done that. There's no way to do it that a week later, the next day, everybody's going to say, Margaret was right. She picked the exact right 6 stories for the front page. Yeah.
There's people waiting.
Well, I don't know if we want to,
Okay.
I want to be able
We'll
to
do it
get to
later.
a number of different questioners. Perhaps there'll be time afterwards.
Yeah, hi, my name's Dave Price. I'm a retired journalist and journalism professor. The 2 newspapers that I worked for no longer exist. The News Bureau that I worked for no longer exists. The college does, it's just been renamed, but it does exist. So that's good. And my question is going to come back to something Professor Lehman said. We all kind of live in a time when we think, we kind of forget history. And your analysis of what came before that 1950s to 80 period, which is the period that I worked in, is brilliant. And of course, the reason I say it's brilliant, I agree with it. But other than that. But we are in this, it's a very strange time for us, but not so strange when you look at previous history of American journalism. As bad as the 2016 election was, nobody was called a hermaphrodite, which actually was done in Jefferson's time. So my question, though, is this. What really troubles me is back then, all this falsehood, you kind of had to make an effort to get it. It had to be posted on the door or delivered somewhere, and it could be a month later, and maybe the truth had emerged by then. Now we have this instantaneous, and I don't want to go into the problems of instantaneous, but what my question is, how worried should we be? That's number one, which I think is yes. I'll answer that. So my real question is this. Is it even possible to return to that time, given the changes in technology, given the changes in television? One of the things, what's news, you talk about that, but I think people have another problem between determining what's TV news, what's paper news, what's internet news. There's so many types of news now. So can we even go back to that period? That's what I'm wondering.
Nick, I think that was directed at you.
Or any panelist.
You can, but I don't think we want to, because there's a way to do it that, so, I talk about this a lot with journalists, and for instance, you could re-regulate broadcasting. Right. You could bring back the fairness doctrine and the equal time rule and things like that. Among my fellow journalists, especially broadcast journalists, that has a 0% approval rating, because everybody wants their industry to be deregulated. Then if I said, okay, let's take the next step and regulate the internet, that would be even less popular. And if I said, let's create an economic landscape that gives newspapers this kind of, the reason Craigslist succeeded is they did a better job of delivering a service than their newspaper classified ad competitors. So there are ways to bring back the good old days if they were good, but most people find them pretty unattractive. And I think it's a better model to say, let's, going back to my distinction between institutions and functions, let's decide what functions that we want to create a lot of support and protection around, and then invent new institutions like the de novo nonprofit sector news that some of us are involved in to be the new bearers of those functions.
I know Jay wants to speak to this too.
Yeah, what worries me is that, in the context of your question of sort of how does the truth compete when it's, when a lie can be disseminated instantaneously, I would frame it a little differently. In that what worries me is that, in 21st century America, we're faced with, all these problems. We all know what the problems are. And, they really, each and every one of them is actually a pretty tricky, technical, complicated question. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of skill to be able to answer the questions that are placed before the public in an intelligent, informed fashion. But it doesn't take very much to just say something that is, provocative. And I think that that's a real problem And that is that, and I think that that transcends the the fake news, real news divide. And I think that this is one of the reasons why I'm so worried about the decline of the local newspaper. It's and the death of journalists who are actually working beats and actually working their sources. These are the people who know the subject matter on which they're reporting. And I mean, I recall, and I know conservatives were really blown away by the comment that Ben Rhodes made. I think it was to the New Yorker, maybe Atlantic, talking about
Times Magazine.
Talking about how they sold the Iran deal, and he said that the average journalist that we deal with is a 27-year-old, and he said whose prior experience was on the campaign trail and who literally knows nothing. Now, I think that's an overstated, that's overstated, that's hyperbole, but I do think that it gets at something real, which is, you have, people, and I don't mean, not necessarily like, liberal, like mainstream media or conservative media, anywhere, any of these, they're talking about healthcare. Do they actually understand healthcare policy? When Sean Hannity gets on television at 10 o'clock and explains that Obamacare is socialized medicine, does he actually know how Obamacare works and how all of its pieces situate with one another? Or go over, the answer is no, but go over to the dial onto MSNBC and ask the same question about Lawrence O'Donnell. Does he understand that there are drawbacks to this and it's a hard... And I learned that the hard way because when the Obamacare debate was happening in 2009, I wanted to get involved in it, and I was like, wow, I really have to research this, and it took me a long time to figure out how that bill works. And I can tell you that very few people that you see on television popping off on commentary at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Fox News put in that kind of time, but they're still going to tell you what they think. And so that's something that really worries me. Is this decline of expectation that the people offering you an opinion actually have something approaching expertise on it. Not that they have to be a PhD or I wrote my dissertation on managed healthcare, but I read the Congressional Research Service report and I read the CBO thing and I didn't just skim it. I didn't just look at the tables and I looked at it and I thought about it and this is what I think. Do we have those? I think we're lacking those people, especially on television and certainly on talk radio, by the way. And I think that that's a main aspect of the problem as well. And speaking as a conservative, a real problem that I have is that the talk radio model was ported onto Fox News, and now it's spreading everywhere. And that model, while it has certain advantages, in that I like that people can call in and say what they want to say, but C-SPAN does the same thing, so but that has real liabilities, and it just seems to be spreading everywhere throughout television news, and I think it's a huge problem.
Thank you.
Over here.
A couple questions. I'm Kevin. I'm a letter carrier from Oregon. And this is for Jay. Jay, do you think that the established conservative press kind of fell down on the job when it came to criticizing the kind of sensationalistic news that went out on Fox News? Because it seemed to me like the only person who was challenging them was Jon Stewart at 11 o'clock at night, all right? The conservative press wasn't challenging the kind of stuff you would hear on Fox News, and they built a huge membership without any countervailing voice that I saw in the conservative press.
Yes, I think that was a main failure of conservative journalism. And I think that too many conservatives have a conflict of interest. Because, see, in conservative circles, right, 10, 15 years ago, you really made it as a conservative when you got your own talk radio show, right? That was when you were up on that level, right? Well, talk radio, since Rush Limbaugh said those awful things about Sandra Fluke, has really fallen apart with the boycott and just dragged all the talk radio people down with them. But it's been replaced by Fox News. And the incentive structure in conservative media is get on Fox News, get yourself a Fox News contract, and then you can get yourself a book and you can do all of these things. That Fox News is the main point of access for building your own personal brand. So the answer to your question, in my opinion, is yes.
And you said you had another part.
Yeah, just one. I'm just curious, starting with Craig, who, I love your website. I sold my pickup on it a number of years. My question is, for you folks on the stage, what's the first news source you look at every morning?
Good question.
I look at my Twitter feed.
All right, well, let's start. Let's go down the row here. Craig?
For me, it's a collection of RSS feeds, which is a collection of general news, political news, like Political Wire by Tegan Goddard, and a lot of tech stuff, since I do need to get my nerd on.
Okay. Nick?
Probably Politico.
Okay.
I start my day on Twitter every day.
Yeah, Twitter.
And Twitter for me as well. Yep. And the Washington Post, clearly. We have other questions here, and I want to at least take one from the audience that is watching remotely. And one of several questions I have here is, to what extent is the public part of the problem? And I think we're talking about the fake news problem. Isn't it our fault if we buy into fake news? So maybe, Amy, I would ask you to take that on.
I do think it's a consumer responsibility to pay attention and to understand, to recognize the trusted news sources versus the not ones. It's pretty. Some of these fake news websites are pretty transparent, actually, about how fake they are. Just right away, this is completely made up. None of this is true. This is satirical, and that doesn't stop people from sharing it. It doesn't stop people from going on. I think news literacy is a problem, and it's something that the media needs to help with. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely, I think the public has a responsibility to take that on themselves.
And news literacy is actually something that's getting a lot more attention and a lot more funding, which is encouraging.
From the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and we're a nonprofit journalism organization dedicated to raising awareness of global issues and doing so in a climate where perhaps understanding of global issues couldn't be more important. And so our first mission, right, is to just make sure the real reporting is happening in the first place. And we're asking ourselves constantly sort of what's the best way to be most effective then with the projects that we're supporting, and how do we reach new audiences, how do we make sure these stories are traveling, and how do we make sure that, as we're all asking ourselves tonight, that it is believed when it does reach the audience. So we've seen initiatives around transparency, and I'm just interested in hearing from across the panel, like there's a lot of different approaches to tackling this challenge of belief and trust. And do we think sort of pulling the curtain behind and really hearing more directly from journalists and uncovering the process, the methodologies, would that make a difference? Do we think the public would react really to that and believe it more? And then also, in terms of reaching new audience, what about the power of live events? And there's much more limited numbers that you're reaching, but we do a ton of educational outreach, which gets to the media literacy point, and not just from understanding the literacy aspect of it, but actually knowing the issues in the first place. The best way to recognize fake news is if you actually are introduced to what these issues are in the first place, right? And have a chance to challenge and have a dialogue. So I guess two questions. One, what's the potential for transparency in combating this? And also education outreach and live events. Thank you.
Anybody?
So, Margaret, you mentioned Thanksgiving dinner.
Yes, I did.
And embedded in that was the implication that you come from an extended family that has a diversity of opinions and journalistic tastes.
Yes.
So I'm from Louisiana. I do too. So I want to say, I've thought about this a lot. There's a dream that, if you go to my cousin, to show you my bona fides, because I know I don't look the part, I have 3 cousins, one named Buddy, one named Bubs, and one named Bubba. So if you go to my cousins Buddy, Bubs, and Bubba and say, do you realize that Fox News is not actually fair and balanced? They're not going to say, oh my God, I didn't know that before. From now on, I'm going to read the New York Times. there's certain numbers of people out there who are, when they're looking for news, what they're really looking for is, I want to find somebody who sort of has the same perspective I have. I'm not looking for information, and I don't think it's informational. So it's very hard to sort of get those people to come to Jesus, so to speak. I've noticed with my children, who tend to be on the other end of the spectrum, like one of my sons, has anybody ever heard of a documentary called Loose Change? So it's a documentary about how the 9/11 attacks didn't happen. And one of my sons really liked that documentary and many other things like it. And he was a kid, and I was able to sort of penetrate with him that things like that aren't actually real. But I do think that this dream of you can pop the bubble and just say this isn't real, and then all the large audiences for this stuff will just go away, is unrealistic. I think, I'll just give you a variant. I know the Pulitzer Center well, and I really admire the work you do. And I believe Craig is one of your funders even, or at least I saw you at their fundraiser. I think, I want to speak personally, a version of what I said in the policy sense. Just as I think it's more possible, though hard, to create real journalism than to make sure there isn't any of the other stuff, I personally try to do everything I can to create more real journalism, both through my own work and in, teaching, and I'm now running a little publishing company that's very much in the spirit of what you guys do. It's called Columbia Global Reports, and we do international reporting. So in a sense, that's what I feel like I can do as an individual journalist. I wish I could be more invested in the idea if people only knew the truth, they would, just stick to the real news, but I'm not so sure.
Okay. We're going to take 2 more questions because we're running out of time, so we'll go here first.
Hi, my name is Barry Jickers. I'm not a journalist. I'm a retired space scientist from the agency. I'm going to go through history, and I want you to relate what you're doing now to what happened in the last 250 years in the United States. Jefferson manipulated the press. The Federalists manipulated the press. Jump 50 years ahead, Samuel F.B. Morse, strong nativist, strong anti-abolitionist, manipulated the telegraph system. Lincoln gave his speeches, gave it to the press, got visibility. A few years later, this guy from New York named Teddy Roosevelt learned that he could manipulate the press by talking to writers. His niece's husband, Franklin, learned the same thing by manipulating the radio to communicate. So as time went on, and then you go into the 50s and 60s, you learn the press is being manipulated one way or the other. And now, you have Twitter, you have Facebook. You're doing the same thing that Jefferson did. What lessons did we learn? What did the journalists learn over the past 200-something years that people want to manipulate and they're not stopped?
Okay, thank you. Jay's going to take that on.
Well, I would just start as a point. I think that your point is overstated. And I'll just give you one example. When we talk about Jefferson manipulating the press, Thomas Jefferson got a contract for Philip Freneau, who was a buddy of Madison's from Princeton, to start a newspaper basically funded through the State Department. He founded the National Gazette. And if you go to the founders.archives.gov and read Madison's National Gazette essays, you will see they are some of the most erudite pieces about the meaning of republicanism that I've ever read. So to suggest that this is manipulation, Jefferson had a partisan agenda, but he also thought he was being a steward of the public interest. And I think that one of the challenges in general in our country, and we've been dealing with it since the first breach between Madison and Hamilton in 1790, is that, you know, we have these views of the public interest that are opposed to each other, and they end up revolving around partisan issues. So, I mean, to say that the press has been manipulated, I mean, is the press manipulated? Sure. Do politicians try and work the press over? Sure. But, you know, Lincoln was trying to hold the Union together. You know, I mean, he wasn't just doing it to be, you know, a bad dude. You know, and the same thing with Jefferson and Madison. You know, they were expounding upon, you know, how is public opinion supposed to thwart a, you know, an incipient monarchy, which is what they thought was really happening. So I think that, you know, it's important not to overstate, you know, manipulation. That's a tough word.
But doesn't Trump feel that he was following the leaders?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I can't speak to what Trump's self-conception of himself is, you know. Does Trump, you know...
You said you read Twitter.
Does he, you know, does he think that he's following in the Jeffersonian tradition? Yeah, probably. But, I mean, my perspective is that Trump's playing the same game that he's been playing with for 30 years, and he's playing it with the same guy. I mean, 30 years ago, it was the New York Post, which was owned by Rupert Murdoch, and Donald Trump going back and forth. And here we are in 2017, and it's the Fox News owned by Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump going back and forth. You know, that's a very different, you know, that's a different animal than Abraham Lincoln, you know, persuading journalists, you know, or like Daniel Webster, you know, his second reply to Haney, specifically written for the press. I mean, that's one basket, and the Trump, it's like all the way off stage, you know. Those are two very different things, in my opinion.
Thank you. And we're going to take one question and wrap it up. So, you're up.
We spent a lot of time talking about the institution of journalism, or the institution where institutions where journalism resides, newspapers, television stations, and then the importance of sort of the things that journalists do in terms of reporting. And it seems to me that in the present day, what you're asking of the institutions is a lot to ask of for-profit corporations in a capitalist-based economy, right? Like, those things aren't producing profits that are gonna work for them, right? So it seems like, and that's not a media company-based phenomena. It seems like you're arguing, right, I went to journalism school, right? You're arguing for a public good that is different and doesn't fit in that economic reality that we live in. And so what is it about the paradigm that we can shift so that you get the good that we all want, right, which is a more educated democracy, but we sort of still are able to function in the world that we live in and make relevant decisions and have a informed democracy?
Great question. Nick Lemon is going to handle that.
So let me use some analogies. I mean, I think you're right in the way you frame it. And, you know, the newspaper industry in 1997, 20 years ago, was one of the most profitable industry sectors in the country. And it could really afford to have some of these public functions loaded onto its back, you know, no problem. A lot of the arguments, some of us are old enough to remember, you know, we'd say, please learn to live with 27% profit margins instead of 36%, so you can, you know, perform these public functions. And that's just never going to happen again. So you're right that the way to frame it is how to think about this institutionally. Analogies I would put forth for the audience to consider. I mean, we're at the beginning of that conversation. Sort of the first thing that's happened is this not-for-profit sector in news that's come up in the last few years with many promising parts, like the Pulitzer Center. Think about urban transportation, which began in the 19th century as a pure for-profit business for various reasons, chief among them the automobile coming along. Became very hard to make money in the business, and society decided, you know what, this is a good thing, even though it's not able to be purely supported by the market, so we're going to create a kind of hybrid model. We're going to still charge fees and have earned income, but we're also going to have public funding and other forms of funding. Opera and symphony are other examples of, you know, these were started as pure commercial enterprises, and they were supported by the market. The market support was taken away as new forms of entertainment came along, like the movies, and society decided we have to keep these things alive because they're valuable beyond their market function. We didn't do that with you know, people who put shoes on horses and barrel stavers, so it's not true in every case. But I think this is the classic case where we need to find our way to a kind of mixed model that, because the pure market model, which worked for a moment in our history, doesn't work anymore, and I don't see it likely to work as well as it used to in my lifetime.
So we've had great questions and I think great discussion. And I just want to mention, you know, I actually am very lucky because I live about half a block from here, literally. But everyone else has traveled and they have been a wonderful panel, and I'd ask you to recognize them. And that's it. Thank you very much.